Okay. Well, first, thank you, and thank you, Nancy, and thank you to everybody here on staff for having me. And I'm just going to start right off with the beginning. I arrived in Israel on October 6th, which was the night of Simchat Torah. And the goal was to visit my daughter who lives in Tel Aviv. And I got there and I went out that night to celebrate at a shul, dancing with the Torah. It was beautiful. It was just this magical evening, people celebrating. And the next morning, I woke up in the hotel to sirens and alarms at 6:30 in the morning, at which time all of the people in the hotel were running to the stairwells. And by the third time, we learned something was happening along the border of Gaza. And I had lived in Israel for many years in the 90s and early 2000s and spent a lot of time on kibbutzes. And I'm assuming everybody here knows what a kibbutz is. And I had family on two kibbutzes. One was kibbutz Chatzor, where my in-laws lived, and the other was this kibbutz called Kfar Aza, along the border with Gaza. My sister-in-law lived there. She raised her kids. And we spent many Shabbats there and birthdays. And somebody said, there's something happening along the border with Gaza. So I called my family, and no one answered. And I called a sister-in-law living in Tel Aviv area, and I said to her, Nira, what's going on? And the first thing she said to me was that my niece Smadar, her husband Roi, and their little girl Abigail had been murdered by Hamas terrorists that morning. And as you can imagine, I'm alone in my hotel, and this is what I'm hearing. And it wasn't a normal day in Israel where after a siren you go out and start life again. It was a day where everything stopped. And I want to just show you a video so that you'll understand what this life was like for my family and what the kibbutz looked like before October 7th. And this was a video that shows the kids in my family that were all affected by October 7th. And I just show it to you to kind of just show you what normalcy looked like before this date.
Is Abigail in the yellow shirt?
Abigail's that little girl in the right in between, yeah.
יד, רגע, פנדל, פנדל.
תמסור לצעירים.
ענבר, גם לילדים. ענברי, גם לצעירים, בבקשה. יש לו
אביגיל.
So the reason I show this is because you see how children lived barefoot, running around this beautiful green property. And my family lived there for over 60 years. So what we learned that morning was from a 6- and a 9-year-old, a little boy and a little girl, Michael and Amalia, who were locked in a cupboard, not a closet, not in a safe room, but literally in a cupboard with a cell phone. And what they told us was that that morning at 6:30, when the alarm started, and think about this, when you live in Tel Aviv, you have like 10 minutes before the missiles come. When you live at the border, you have seconds, you don't even have a full minute to get to your safe room. And so my niece was putting her 3 children, 6, 9, and 3 years old, in their safe room when Hamas terrorists came in and murdered her in front of these 3 little kids. Now, her husband had gone out when the alarm started because he was a photojournalist, and he had done this many times before, where he went outside and he would take film and he would be able to then put it out on Ynet, which was a major distribution of news in Israel. But what he realized was that this wasn't a normal missile. He actually captured paragliders coming in. He actually captured what was happening in the air at that moment. He ran back, and these 3 little kids were coming outside. He picked up Abigail in his arms, the 2 other kids by his side, and they ran. And then Hamas terrorists murdered him. With Abigail in his arms, he fell onto her. The 6- and 9-year-old believed that not only their father, but their little sister had been killed as well. They ran home and locked themselves in this cupboard. And for 14 hours, that is where they stayed and they got rescued by literally the equivalent of our Navy SEALs, a special operation that had to go in because On that morning, there were about 650 people on the kibbutz, and there were over 300 terrorists who had arrived to kill, kidnap, and burn. And these two little kids were our only voice. They were taken out after 14 hours. Across the kibbutz, my other niece and her husband lived with their twins, 13 years old, and a 10-year-old little girl. They were locked in their safe room, their house. They shut off all their appliances. They turned off the lights. But my nephew had looked outside early in the morning, and he saw this woman, this young woman with a 1-month-old infant in her arms, in her pajamas. And he brought her in. Her husband had just been murdered. In this little room, they had an infant 1 month old that they didn't know if she would cry. She had no diaper, she had no food. And this is how they spent 29 hours. So it took that long before the army could get there, clear it safe enough to get people off of the kibbutz. But what had happened was it actually took about 3 days for them to clear the kibbutz of these Hamas terrorists. Because as you saw in that video, we don't have the pictures. We don't have the rest. Oh, we do? Okay. And as you see in that picture, it's all natural. There's trees, there's bushes, and they were hiding, and it was horrible. But after 3 days, what they did was they checked to see who was still there. And Abigail, this little 3-year-old, was nowhere to be found. And so at that moment, we sort of had something to think about, which was the possibility that Abigail had been taken as a hostage. Can you put the first photo on? Yes. Anyhow, the first, yeah, it should be, there you go. So this is a picture of Abigail and her mother and her father and her brother and her sister. And this is my niece Smadar and her husband Roe, and they were those who were killed. The little boy and the little girl, they are the ones who ended up being in this closet. And Abigail, there was nowhere to be found. If you switch to the next one. Anyhow, what I ended up doing was going back to America the next day, because people said, get out, you'll be a better voice, you'll do more for us if you go back to the States. So I came back to the States, and I started telling the story about Abigail being killed and her parents being killed. But about a week later, we learned that Abigail had survived. And how do we learn that she had survived? She was not there. But she had actually crawled out from under her father's body that morning, covered in his blood, and gone to a neighbor. And the part that is so miraculous is that this little 3-year-old's running around with Hamas terrorists everywhere, and she manages to get to the home of somebody that she knew. It was the family, her father's best friend's family. She went to school with the little boy, but everybody was locked in their safe rooms. And so the fact that this man was actually going out because he was part of the security for the kibbutz, and he opened the door and he sees little Abigail, who he knows very well, drenched in her father's blood. He brings her inside and he puts her with his wife and their 3 kids, a 10, an 8, and a 4-year-old. He goes out to protect the kibbutz and he doesn't come back. He's injured. But what he tells everybody is that he actually did put Abigail in the safe room. Then another witness on the kibbutz actually saw the Hamas terrorists marching this woman Hagar and her 3 kids off the kibbutz, but no one actually saw Abigail. But we assumed at this point that she wasn't there, so she was a hostage. So what I did was I woke up and I'm like, okay, how do I get this child? What can I do to help the hostages? And I took this picture that my relative sent me, and I looked in the eyes of this little girl, and I said, I'm going to save you. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I was like, okay, this is something that I can do. And I took this picture, and I made hundreds of copies of this picture and hundreds of copies of the picture that many of you are familiar with, that was the mosaic of all the faces. At that time, there were about 246 people. Children, there were 35 children that day under the age of 18 who were kidnapped. There were 1,200 people who were murdered that day, and about 246 people who were taken hostage. Just to give you an understanding, 47 of those, including my niece, were Americans who were murdered that day. And of the hostages, there were 12 Americans. As I speak to you today, there's still 7 Americans. And as I speak to you, there's still 90 hostages. But I took this picture and I went to Capitol Hill. And I went very early on, and I met with Democrats, and I met with Republicans, and I met with anyone that we could tell the story with. And I went with this other family of Keith Siegel, who was an American hostage, also from the same kibbutz, Kfar Aza. He and his wife were kidnapped. Aviva was also released the day that Abigail was, but her husband Keith wasn't. But at that point, I was with their family, Keith's sister, and we were telling everyone the story. Within a couple weeks, a lot of the families were coming over. But the reason I say this is because one of the things I learned from this experience is that we had Dems and we had Republicans. We made sure that the hostages were not politicized, that people could not say it was a Democratic issue or a Republican issue, but it was an American issue. And to this day, and I say this with great respect, we have men and women leaders on both sides of the aisle who have been there for the hostage families, and that has been something that we can look at as Americans and say, okay, we can do it, and here it is, a perfect example of this bipartisanship. Abigail was released after 51 days. There was a deal that was done at the end of November 2023. It was led by President Joe Biden and his team, and it was brokered by the Qataris. And one of the things that I kept thinking was like, okay, you can fight, you can have war, but the diplomacy is what is going to bring home these hostages. And it worked at that point, but it only brought home 105 women and children. There were still over 150 people that were not brought home that day. But it broke down, and we just kept going and telling the stories. And one of the things that I realized was that we needed to make these people humans. And that picture of Abigail, it's okay. That picture of Abigail was what people understood was the face of a hostage. You can switch to the next one, please. So this was an example, this photo, of the advocacy. We, the American families, went and spoke with all the leaders in Congress, with the other families, Israelis. Just to keep in mind, there were over 30 nations represented in these hostages, over 5 religions. There were Muslims, there were Jews. It wasn't a Jewish situation, it wasn't an Israeli situation, it was a humanitarian crisis. So this is a photo, these are the American families, and as you can see, each one had their photos of their loved ones, and we were in front of the White House. And we did press conferences, and basically that photo of Abigail and the one of the 246, I gave out to everyone. I gave it out to the leaders, I gave it out to the staff, I gave it out to security. When we did any of the media, I gave it out to the reporters, I gave it out to the camera people. The goal was to make sure that everyone got this photo and got the photo of all the hostages, because what we needed was for them to be humanized. And one of the things that I like to talk about is like, the other side of it is the humanized state of our leaders. Like, we went into meetings where we had people that were elected leaders that were crying. We had elected leaders that were hugging us. We had elected leaders from both sides that were doing everything they could on their social media, on the floor of the House, on the floor of the Senate, to talk about these hostages. And I wrote this book, which I will talk about in a minute, but I tell the story about Susan Collins. And early on, I met her with a group of Republican women that I was introduced to by an evangelical woman, a leader, and she brought myself and this other family, and we met with these 6 Republican women senators, and one was Susan Collins. And this was really early on, and I went up to Susan Collins, and I gave her the photo of Abigail, and I said, please, she has no parents to speak for her. She is an orphan, and I am going to speak for her, but I need you to go and speak for her. About 3 days later, Susan Collins was on a Kodel in Israel with Democrats and with Republicans. And my daughter happened to be at a meeting that they went to, my daughter who lived in Israel, and she went up to Susan Collins and she said, I want to tell you about my cousin Abigail, who was taken hostage. And before Noah, my daughter, could actually hand her the picture, Susan Collins pulled the picture of Abigail from her purse and said, I received this photo from your relatives in America, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she comes home. A few hours later, there was a press conference in Tel Aviv, and Susan Collins was the speaker for the Dems and the Republicans. She picked up Abigail's picture to show the world, this is what a hostage looks like. This is what a 3-year-old hostage looks like, who was taken by Hamas terrorists after they killed her parents. And it still makes me emotional because for 51 days, Susan Collins took that photo out and showed everyone, no matter where in the world she was, no matter who she was meeting with. And she has continued to be a very big supporter of getting the hostages out, as have been many of her colleagues. But I tell that story because that was one of the things that got people to understand, which was getting a leader to make this a human situation. You can just get to the next photo, that would be great. So Abigail was released after 51 days, but she wasn't released on the first day of the hostage release. She wasn't released on the second day. And here we are today with these releases. And we're seeing 3 young women last week, 4 young women today. There's still 25, 26 that are supposed to come out in the first 6 weeks. But even beyond that, there's still 60 people that need to still come out. And the reason I talk about it is because that broke down after 6 days. We can't afford for it to break down again. So one of the things that myself and other hostage families, both here and in Israel, are doing is telling these stories, because we can't let the leaders on both sides, we know one is a Hamas terrorist organization, and we know the other one is Prime Minister Netanyahu, but we can't afford to let anyone at this moment let these talks and the ceasefire break down. This is a picture on the 51st day of little Abigail, who was already little, but literally came out emaciated. They were given 1 piece of pita bread a day, very little water. Hagar, the woman who was with her, talks about smelling tea that the Hamas terrorists were cooking, the food they were cooking. None was given to these children. None were given to Hagar. But, and in addition, these children had nothing. They were silenced. They were put in a dark room. They had 2 toothbrushes. There were 6 of them. They had to beg for paper to go to the bathroom. They had given a pad of paper with pencils that weren't sharpened, that Hagar had to sharpen with her own fingernails. I mean, they were given 2 decks of cards. So for 51 days, Hagar actually thought that her husband had been murdered. The kibbutz was no longer there. Israel was no longer there. But she breathed hope into these kids in silence. They were not allowed to make noise. Now, Abigail is this very vivacious, big personality. And when you're in the room with her, you just think, oh my gosh, she's just got so much energy. But to think that for 51 days, this child was silenced with 3 other children. And this is just one story of many that took place over that 51-day period. But that is my niece, Liron, and my sister-in-law, Shlomit, there to receive Abigail when she was literally handed over to the Israelis. And I'll say one thing, we see these hostage releases, but one thing that I learned very early on, and they said this to us over and over, go tell your story. We're going to make a deal. But until you actually see your loved one in the arms of the family, you can't actually believe that it's really true. And here she is, and you see this a few hours later smiling. She's back with her grandparents and with her aunt and her uncle. And she knows that her parents aren't there, as much as a 3-year-old can know. She turned 4 2 days before she was released. And we went out and told everyone that it was her birthday. But Hamas didn't let her out for her birthday. They let her out on the 3rd day. So I just show you this picture because this is what we're seeing right now. But this is a 4-year-old, a recently turned 4-year-old. Could you go to the next photo? Anyhow, what I want people to know is that what happened on October 7th, we saw Hamas terrorists filming on their GoPros. And we also saw them denying it. And we saw other people denying what happened on October 7th. So part of why I tell this story and I wrote this book is to tell people who may not be connected that there's what happened that day. And this is an example of a home on that beautiful kibbutz that I showed you in the beginning. This is one of the homes. And this isn't unique in the sense that it's the only one. Every house had some form of damage. Some were burned, but you see things that were brought outside. And what you also see is like the graffiti on the wall, the yellow and the red and the blue. And those were different organizations that had gone in to check the house to make sure that there weren't bombs left there. It also told if somebody was killed there. It was very much clear what happened in that house by this graffiti. Go to the next photo. And I just want to point out, if you see on the right that fence, this is how close the fence was to Gaza. And this next picture is a picture that I took standing in the kitchen of my niece's house. And the reason why I felt that this picture was important was to show that that morning, you see the overturned furniture, you see all the mess on the floor. This is what they did in these homes. This was done. My niece was laying there, dead. Her children were in a cupboard. But you also see like what it looked like that morning, like we all would have. Get up the next morning, clean the kitchen, the dishes. This was exactly how this house was left when I was there. When I got back to Israel in the early days of December after Abigail's released, I went to the kibbutz because I wanted to be able to come here and tell people like yourselves truly what happened that morning. And I wish I could say this was the only house this happened. This happened in hundreds of houses. Thousands of people were affected along the border of Gaza. So, and by the way, when I was there, you still heard bombs in Gaza. You could hear the machine guns. It's that close. So one of the things that I talk about is here we are now. President Trump is our leader. And President Trump is doing everything, and he's committed to bringing home these hostages. And we keep encouraging and pushing. But at this time, President Biden, and I say this in complete honesty, he was the only leader in the world that was going to fight to make sure that these hostages came home. We saw an incredible silence from world organizations. We saw incredible silence from other leaders. We saw incredible silence from the UN in terms of actually doing what they could to bring home the hostages. So this picture was in April when we went to the White House as guests of the president. But it is because of President Biden, and it is because of the Qataris who did the majority of the mediating. The Egyptians were starting, but they weren't fully in it. But this is because of Qatar and President Biden. But then I say, and President Biden would be the first one to say it, he couldn't get it over the finish line. He could not get a second deal. 14 months later, President Trump was elected, a little bit less than 14 months. And one of the things that was so unique about this was all of a sudden, we had two administrations, a Democratic and a Republican, that were both focused on bringing back the hostages. And I say, I don't know the answer. People say, how did it happen? Why did it happen? All I know is that President Trump was the person who was able to get this next deal over the finish line. It's the same deal that President Biden had been pushing, that Bibi Netanyahu had agreed to, that Hamas had agreed to in different forms. But it was President Trump who got us to this point where a deal was signed, and as you know, minutes, days before the inauguration. But it just also shows you see this little girl and how she was able to get her life back and to keep going. And switch to the next photo. And one of the things for me is like, I keep talking about these people that have been held hostage, and today's 477 days that these young women were held hostage. That and this is just a nice photo of the entire family. And what I like to say, I'm going to skip back here, is that this is my niece and her husband. They survived with their kids, the twins at 13 and the little girl next to them who's 10. But now they're one big family. And people ask, how is Abigail doing? How are her brother and sister doing? And what I try to say is like, the trauma that they experienced, all 6 of these kids, but the 3 that witnessed the murders, it's unexplainable. Like, I can't even fathom it. But what I can tell you all is that they have been able to move forward. And part of the efforts that I keep pursuing is to give these other families the opportunity for their loved ones to come home and for them to move forward. And we know that there are people who are killed, but they need to come home too. But we know there are people who are alive, 7 Americans. And it's a cruel process. It's a cruel process of waiting. But I believe our advocacy, you all being here, people putting it in social media, people speaking about these hostages is part of what we can do to make sure that we keep talking about them until all of them, and there are still 90, are released and they're back with their loved ones so they can begin to begin their healing. And I say this because it's not only the families, but it's the nation of Israel. Israel has not been able to move forward. And I say it about diaspora Jews, people all over the world that are Jewish, being able to move forward and at least to have, not to be still stuck on October 7th, which we all are. But once these hostages come home, we're able to move forward. But I'm going to go back to one of the points why I wrote this book was to tell the truth. Because what I learned was if we don't tell the truth, another narrative will overtake it, which says that this didn't happen. that this wasn't what happened, and that Abigail, a 3-year-old, was a perpetrator or an oppressor. And what I like to say, and Nancy and I have talked about this, is like, at this moment, we all have to be in this together. And what we all need to do is to make sure that the true stories are the stories, that we keep our government together, that we have the U.S. government continuing to put pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to finish the deal. But I also talk about how we put pressure on a lot of the families and the U.S. government and President Trump, and specifically and his team, on the Gulf nations to put pressure on Hamas, to put pressure on Qatar, to put pressure on Egypt. And I like to say, which is not a good thing, but we woke up to this geopolitical nightmare. And we can get into Iran, we can get into all of these different other areas, but for myself and for the hostage families, what we keep going back to is hostages. How do we get these people home? So, go to the next photo if you wouldn't mind. And so for myself and being here today and sharing this story with you is to keep reminding people that there are hostages. And I like to show this next picture, which is I go and I will speak with anyone. This is down in Palm Beach, in West Palm Beach, and this was David Aronson, who's was the Attorney General in that area, and not Attorney General, but county attorney. And he said, "Come and talk with me." And I went there, and he invited his whole staff. 60 people came, Muslims, Christians, very few Jewish people. But they all wanted to hear the story. They all wanted to know what happened on October 7th. And so what I learned from this is we just got to keep having these conversations. And some of the ones that we have to have are the difficult ones. Because if we just have the ones within ourselves that agree, or the ones with ourselves that are fighting for it, what we're going to realize is that we aren't going to be able to prevent future attacks and prevent other situations where you have a humanitarian crisis and a terror attack. And I like to show this picture because President Biden, before he invited us to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu on July 25th. And we had the Biden team, we had the Biden team, we had the Netanyahu team. And at this moment, I'm sitting here with families whose loved ones have been hostages for almost a year. And at that moment on July 25th, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, "We've got a deal. We can sign it. We're very close." And he committed to us in that room that he was very close. But nothing happened. So for myself and for others, we could have all given up. We could have all said, "Ugh, this is just so..." But the families and everybody that has been supporting us said, "Okay, we keep going, we keep going." And here we see that it's half a year later, and we're just getting these people to come home. So, the next photo. So I just like to show, like, this has been a full effort of the U.S. government. And I just was in D.C. for the inaugural ceremonies, and President Trump brought the hostage families on the stage, and he recommitted to bringing them home. And so for me, there is this reassurance. And his team has been working with President Biden's team for the last month. So it wasn't like the Biden team stepped aside or the Biden team didn't let the Trump team in. They were working together. So you have Steve Witkoff, who is the envoy for President Trump. You have Brett McGurk, who was the envoy for Biden, with Jake Sullivan and Mike Waltz and all of these people, all of these leaders, and you see them all working together. And you see that there's been this handoff, but it's a handoff that says we're all still committed to making it happen. And I'll just say this other piece, which was the American hostage families met with Brett McGurk and Jake Sullivan, most likely, I would say once a month, either in the White House or virtually. But it was a communication. They weren't just going and doing this without having time to speak with the American families. So there's never been something like this. We've never had something like this. Please God, we never have it again. But I go to the humanization and the understanding of our U.S. government about how we work with our people. This is just a nice picture to show that Abigail, got to come to America. She stole my shoes. She got to have a life. And there's one story that I like to say, which is we went to Disneyland. And we went on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. And I hadn't thought about this, but in the Pirates of the Caribbean, there's the bang and and the noise and the lights and the dark. And when we were on that ride, Abigail's body got all tense because she had spent 51 days where bombs were falling all around her. And her cousin Inbar, one of the kids at 12, he said to her, it's fake. It's okay. You're okay. It's fake. So she could calm down. And then like about an hour later, we were on the Small World ride, where you see these beautiful children dancing in costume. And I see Abigail stand up. You're not allowed to stand up, but she stood up, and she starts dancing, and she starts moving, and she starts being a part of this beautiful ride. And I'll end by saying, and I'm happy to take some questions, but I'll end by just saying, like, that's the world we want our kids to live in. We want them to be in a place where every child can dance and sing, and every child can be free. And I really just go back to Abigail has been freed after being a hostage for almost 2 months, and she's been free for over a year. And she just celebrated her 5th birthday. And for me, the goal is that everybody gets to come home, be with their family, and to celebrate more and more birthdays and to make memories. And I just want to show the video one more time. It's at the end. And I like to show this last video, which is the first video, just to give everybody this reminder of where we started. And by the way, the woman in this is my niece, Smadar, who was murdered. The mother of Abigail and Amalia and Michael.
יד, רגע, פנדל, פנדל.
בזהירות. הופה! הופה!
תמסור לצעירים.
ענבר, גם לילדים. ענברי, גם לצעירים, בבקשה. יש לו לברי
אביגיל.
So that just gives you an idea of who Abigail is, the little child who kept up with all the other kids. The youngest, as you can see, the littlest. And the voice in the background is my sister-in-law, Shlomit. And I think in this like 30 seconds, it kind of tells you all about what life was like. And without Smadar and without Roi, this family is still sticking together, and we're still doing everything we can to ensure that Abigail and her kids and her siblings and all the kids have an opportunity for a beautiful life. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm very happy to take questions, but I just really want to say thank you for showing up. Thank you for being here. Because people say to me, like, how do you do this? And it's like when people like yourselves show up to support myself and my work, but really to support all the hostage families. I just want to say thank you. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned the Qataris.
Yeah.
What influence do you think they have over Hamas?
Say that again?
The Qataris.
Yeah.
What influence do you think they have over Hamas?
Yeah. So your question is, what influence the Qataris have over Hamas? I can just say from my experience and from what I've learned from this, you know, back in, I can't remember which year right now, but back around 2012, 2013, the United States, the government at the time, and the Israeli government, Bibi, Netanyahu, they said to, Hamas was in Turkey at that time, and they asked the Qataris to have Hamas be centered and located in Doha. And why? So that they could watch over them and they could surveil them, knowing they were a terrorist organization, but having some semblance of control. And what I understood is that was how Qatar was even more involved. But keep in mind, the Qataris have become known for helping to get hostages out. So when we hear about hostage releases in Russia, North Korea, Afghanistan, many times Iran, many times the Qataris are involved in that. So when you say what influence do they have over Hamas, I'm not quite sure. But what I understand is that they are the channel that has the ability to influence Hamas. But then you think about Hamas, there's Hamas in Gaza, which is the fighting wing, and then there's Hamas in Doha, which is the legislative wing, so it's so complicated. But what I do know is that the Qataris were those that put the pressure on Hamas to get that first release. But then the second round, they weren't able to put that pressure. And it goes back to Hamas didn't think they had anything to lose. They were willing to stay there. Israel couldn't show the political will either for all those months. So when you ask that question about like what influence they have, it's a terrorist organization. And it is so complicated, and it's years of getting to this moment. And we can talk about Hamas and funding, Qataris funding Hamas, Qataris funding the Palestinian Authority. We can talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu, his role he played in that. But what I like to talk about right now, and I really mean this, is how do we move forward at this moment, because we have to get 90 people out. And right now, it is the Qataris and the Egyptians that are the mediators and that did put pressure on Hamas to get this deal done. It's not really the answer. It's not an open, closed answer, but I understand how we got here in many ways. But at this moment, and I will answer one other thing. It is the Qataris, the only Arab nation that met with myself and other hostage families, both Americans and international families and Israelis. And they met with us in Washington, D.C. with their ambassador. We were invited to Qatar to meet with the prime minister and the negotiating team. And that was after Abigail was released in hopes of getting a second deal going. So it isn't a clear answer. But right now, the Qataris are the people that are helping us. And they are the ones that, with the Egyptians, made this deal possible from a mediation perspective. Yeah.
Do they feel that all the hostages are still in Gaza, or were they moved to Syria or Lebanon?
Okay, so your question is, are the hostages all still in Gaza? Look, there's so many stories, and what I've learned about the press is it's not easy to know what the truth is. I'll give you this example. We're sitting in a meeting with Jake Sullivan in the White House one day, and there was a deal out there. And one of the families gets a notification on their phone, and the notification is, Hamas doesn't agree to the deal. So the family member says to Jake Sullivan, I just got a notification. Hamas doesn't agree to the deal. And Jake Sullivan's sitting there, and he doesn't have that information. He doesn't know anything about it, and it's not happened. So I think what I'm trying to tell you is, like, there's been so many stories. There was a story going on in the end of summer. All the hostages were dead. Nothing to fight for. Hamas killed them all. They were all dead. And us hostage families were like, no, we're going to keep fighting. We believe many of them are still alive. And even up until the last week, we had stories of people weren't alive, they were alive. But we saw 7 young women come out. And my belief is that until we can see everybody and get them out, we're going to believe as many of them are alive as possible. And as far as moving them, again, stories. They're going to take them under the Rafah crossing, take them to Egypt, take them. As best as I know, they're all in Gaza. Sometimes the question is where they are in Gaza. Who's holding them? Is it Hamas? Is it Islamic Jihad? But as far as I understand, the bodies, the live people are still in Gaza. Yeah.
Will your family eventually go back to that same area?
You know, for my niece, she's never going back. Her husband would consider it, right? And that's sort of where the families lie in terms of, are they going back, are they not? I was just recently at another kibbutz called Ra'im that was very, very badly attacked. Lots of deaths, lots of kidnapping. And right now there's over 100 people that have moved back, but none with small children. And they're not permanently there, but they have a factory and they have a business, so people have come back. But it's really not clear. First, I don't think it's safe. First, and second, there's so much destruction. There's so much that needs to be cleaned up. And there's a couple of communities that really don't have structures left. So I think it's a very complicated question, but I do believe that people do want to go back to the border, and people do want to go back. It was paradise. I mean, you see that. It was paradise. But for many, it's very scary. And with small children, it's not a safe place. And there's no schools there. There's very little infrastructure. Businesses have closed. So it's also not an accessible, easy place for a family or for people to live now. Yeah.
Prior to October 7th, was it, being that it was so close to the border, did people ever, you describe it as paradise, was there ever any type of fear or areas that people stayed away from, or what was that like prior to October 7th being so close?
Yeah, so prior to October 7th, there was always fear. But you balanced it with quality of life. And for most of these people, there was a good quality of life. And for many of these people, like my family, this is the only place they ever knew. My niece and nephew, this was their home. And my sister-in-law and her husband moved there very young. They got married young and they moved there. But one of the things that I talk about in the book is children on that kibbutz, they knew if there was a siren to run. They ran to an adult, they ran to a place. It was part of life. And it's a cruel part of life. We would never want that for our children. We would never accept that. But it was what they accepted. But they also believed that the Israeli government, the IDF, was there to protect them. And what they learned that day was there was a failure. I can't speak to what will happen. There needs to be an inquiry. There needs to be a lot done. But there was a failure. But before that, there was this feeling of that we have a protection. The IDF is there. Our troops are there. The government's going to protect us. And it didn't happen. Yeah.
The hostage families wrestle with the exchange when convicted murderers are, where families in Israel are now seeing their loved ones who were murdered by people now being released and obviously paraded through Gaza this morning. You even saw it, some of that. I mean, there's no right or wrong here, but it's got to be a wrestling of some sort.
Yeah, so the question is, how do the hostage families reckon, I'm going to answer as if I say it incorrectly, but it's a complicated one. How do hostage families deal with the fact that Sinwar was released in a hostage deal, terrorist, and that in this deal, and you saw this, the civilian women, it's one civilian woman to 40 prisoners. Some of them are really dangerous prisoners. They have blood on their hands. With the women today, the 4 women, 1 to 50, so that means 200. And so the question is, how does the Israeli public grapple with it? And as you know, it's very diverse in Israel. So you have people, and I'm telling you, you have people right now who have hostages that are saying, don't make a deal, it's not good enough. And you have people who say, my son is a soldier, he's not coming out to the second part of the deal, it's not going to happen, don't make this deal. But then you have others that say, my son is in the second deal, but let's get started. Because if we don't get started, we're never going to get these people home. You have all sides of it. And then you have, and my heart breaks, you have over 450 young soldiers that have lost their lives to fight for this. And then you say to their families, we're going to make a deal. And they say, but my son lost his life to get rid of Hamas completely in order to, and they're not necessarily satisfied. But one of the things I learned early on, when Gilad Shalit was released, there was a deal 5 years before that was presented to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and it was 1 soldier to 1,000 prisoners. 5 years later, 1 soldier for 1,027. So what we learned, and we learned it also with the deal back in November, if you don't make a deal, the price gets higher, and it gets harder to get the hostages back, and they die in captivity. And we've seen them. They have died. We don't know all who have died, but we know they've died. We know they've been killed by friendly fire. We know that they were killed by IDF bombing, but we also know they've been murdered and abused, raped, and starved. And so it's so complicated, but the way I think that the majority of people, and you see the polls, are we need to bring home our loved ones. We need to end this fighting. And we need to start, and I keep saying this no matter what, the fighting stops when you bring home these hostages. And we can agree and disagree on the severity of the fighting, but on October 7th at 6:25 there was a ceasefire, and at 6:30 it was broken. And one of the things that I speak about, and I know in this neighborhood where you live, you have people that are very much on the other side, that deny October 7th, and that don't think that what I'm telling you is the truth. But what I keep talking about, and Nancy and I keep talking about, is I'm sitting here with my niece and her husband murdered, Abigail having been a hostage, and saying to you all, and I say this with great sincerity, and I've said it from the beginning, and most of the hostage families that I work with say the same thing. Bring home our loved ones, stop the fighting, and we need to make sure that the people living in Gaza are afforded a dignity, a security, food, and it's what we believe. But it all starts with releasing and freeing the people that were kidnapped and stolen on October 7th. I don't think I answered the question in a succinct manner or in a manner that gets us to the other side, but that's how complicated it is.
And I knew there wasn't an answer.
I know. But I think it's an important conversation because it tells you how much is going into the calculations just in terms of saving these people. And then you say to yourself, these prisoners come back, what are they going to do to Israel? How are they going to endanger Israel? And part of what the plan is that some of them are going to be sent to different countries. But at the end of the day, these are people that are guilty of murder that are being released so we can bring home our loved ones. And that's a tough price we're paying. Yeah.
I don't know if this is so much a question because I read something today where it said that Israel, the IDF estimates they have gotten 20,000 Hamas terrorists that have killed, that have been killed, but they have recruited, Hamas has recruited 15,000 during this time. So I guess from what I see, like how effective is the war? And from my perspective, I think getting the hostages home is the important thing, and trying to do something with Gaza to prevent this from happening in the future.
I agree. The idea is that we have to bring home these hostages. And again, with the news that we've killed X amount of Hamas terrorists and more have cropped up and more have been, what we also know is that Hamas has been depleted of what they had before, which was the easy flow of weaponry and ammunition, and that a lot of it has been depleted. Gaza's like leveled. They're not, and Hamas is not in a place of power, and that is part of why they've made this deal. What you're asking me is a speculation that I can't answer, and I sort of stay away from that because I say, like, that doesn't help me get these hostages back. And until we get these hostages back, Israel can't really move forward. But I also am really clear Israel must be a sovereign, secure state. And if that is the truth, we have to attend to that, and Israel must deal with that, and all the allies must. But for right now, the goal has to be bringing back these hostages. And so, like, when the news goes that way and the news goes this way, I just keep going straight on, how do we bring home these people? And it goes back to, how do we get the U.S. government to put the pressure? Because it is the U.S. government that is leading this. Yeah.
Does Abigail ever reference or talk about her time? Is she able to put in words some of the stuff, or let any of your family members know what that was?
Yeah, so the question is, does Abigail talk about her time in Gaza and talk about what happened? She knows exactly what happened. She was 3 and she turned 4, but she knew what was going on. You know, sometimes you're talking and she'll be like, I was in Gaza. Like, she knows. And she knows she's with Hagar. And she knows she's with Hagar's kids. The other questions that you have are like what I told you about the rides. You know, when she hears loud noises, she does get tensed up. She is going to, for the rest of her life, have effects, and so are all the siblings and the cousins. And you understand with kids, you sort of wait for them to bring it up. And so one of the things the family and we all do is let her bring it up. But she knows that her parents aren't here. But what does that mean to a 3-year-old? And so, or now a 5-year-old, she just turned 5. But I think that the question is, how do you give love and support and give her all the things that she will need to have a healthy life, but she will always have that trauma? And that's just going to be a fact. But she knows who she was with. She knows where she was. And I'm not saying that in anything other than a matter of fact. These people that were hostages, they will always know what happened to them and where they were. And whether she was 3 or people are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it is devastating. And what I will say to you, for the country of Israel, it is devastating. Everybody knows somebody. Everybody is affected. And so here we are sitting here, and I just keep thinking about a generation of little kids, but generations of bigger kids whose lives are seriously traumatized by October 7th. So it's such a huge question, but it's how do we give love and support, and how do we help everybody to move forward? And it goes back to what I keep kind of like repeating, which is bringing home these hostages. So I'm going to end by saying thank you. I'm here if anybody wants to come up and speak, but I just really want to say thank you. And I wrote this book because if you know people in your communities that don't believe or are questioning what happened, this book, Saving Abigail, it truly tells the story of what happened to Abigail that morning, what happened on her kibbutz that morning, and what happened in Israel. But it also talks about myself and many other people who went out there and to this day are out there fighting to save lives. And it also tells the truth about the amount of people who've lost their lives and who, as hostages not being freed, have been killed or have died. And, you know, one of the things that for me going forward is always going to be important is just telling the story so that we don't let it become a footmark, and that we kind of keep saying to ourselves, like, we can never let this happen again in Israel or anywhere in the world. And so, you know, I did this book and I put it out there, and I'll share this with you. Like, there's no celebration. You can't go out and have a book opening and say, oh, we did this, because here I am speaking to you 6 months after I wrote this book, published it, and we don't have these hostages home. But what I have learned is that it's very powerful to tell the story. And for all of us in this room, this is one story that I hope you'll tell, but I do hope that you'll keep telling the stories of the 90 people, of the 7 Americans, of our young men and women, of our grandparents, that need to be brought home and they need to be freed, so that they can move forward and we can all move forward. So thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure and it's an honor, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.